Welcome to the Purple Warriors podcast. I'm Ali Sugars, your host, and thank you so much for joining me. This podcast is about raising awareness for domestic abuse by allowing survivors to share their own stories and journeys to recovery. It's also about assisting fellow survivors to give you practical yet powerful information that will help you on the road to your recovery. I hope you enjoy the show. We have a special guest on today. Her name is Chris Small. Now, Chris is a DV survivor herself who has worked on the DV crisis line, and she is currently working as a case manager in a women's shelter. So no doubt we're going to get some very valuable information today. So welcome, Chris.
Hi, everyone.
So if you don't mind, Chris, would you be able to tell us maybe a bit about you and, if you're comfortable, a bit about your own survival story?
Sure thing. Well, I've actually had three relationships that involve violence, overt violence. I guess my worst one was when I was around 21 and I met my husband, who was actually a childhood friend. Our families had grown up together and gone camping together. So there was this kind of false sense of knowing him already. He was a troubled person, I would say, knowing his childhood. And my nature of being a helpful, caring person meant that I probably stayed with him longer than I would have, because I cared about what had happened to him as a child, until I finally realised he needs to actually make his own children's life different. Not worry about his, sort it out, but not worry about it every day, or not use it as an excuse. So he was your classic, I guess, Hollywood domestic violence perpetrator, 24-hour surveillance. He would quit jobs so that he could watch me all the time. I actually ended up living overseas, if you call it living. And that was his attempt to isolate me from my family. He had to take me overseas to do it, because I have an extremely strong family who were very worried about me. But he knew how to use, in your 20s, you tend to be separating yourself from your parents, and so you resist a lot of their advice. And so in my 20s, I was very resistant to a lot of my parents' advice, and I was kind of unpacking a whole lot of things from my own childhood. So it was easy for him to manipulate my sense of wanting to create my own life and kind of get in between me and my parents, and confuse me around some of their desire to protect me for control. So I ended up overseas, which is when the violence became really, really bad. The worst thing that he did was one night where he never actually punched me or did anything like that. He would push me and throw me around the room and rape me, and very controlling around what I was doing, where I was going, who I was speaking to. He, if I wanted to speak to a friend in a separate room from him, he would sort of start a fight about, why do you need to have a private conversation? What are you saying about me? So he was extremely paranoid. And have always been known as an extremely independent woman and a very strong woman. And so a psychologist has since told me that because of that it's actually a nature, it is really something I was born with. Men like him tend to have to do more and more, have to resort to physical violence to control me, where sometimes when you're with somebody who uses violence against you, you look at other relationships they've had and they haven't used violence against those women, and that can feed into that notion that it's something about yourself that does that creates that sort of provocation. And this psychologist is a male psychologist who worked with perpetrator men, talked me through that and said it's not about that, it's actually about what they need to resort to control. Some other women might be more or less resistant to the control.
Right. Yeah.
Or more easily controlled in a way that I'm not. I'm kind of able to sort of see through games that people play, and I name it, which is probably not always great for keeping myself safe. So,
and I laugh and I kind of giggle. I mean, it's not funny, but I'm a bit the same way. I'm a very strong personality, so I get where you're coming from. So
yeah. And I guess it's that sort of, you know, there's that stereotype of a domestic violence victim as a weak woman or a woman who's easily controlled. In fact, it's actually the opposite from my experience, is that the more feisty, the more sort of I guess self-aware and self-confident that you are, the more likely you are to be. It's not always the way, but we meet women at the end of their domestic violence experiences, which means that we meet the person that's being impacted by the domestic violence rather than the woman who existed at the beginning of that relationship.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, you know, that thing of that what you're doing is that unpacking and reclaiming yourself and finding that part of yourself again and packing back up all of the bits of the me that you lost along the way, or that you hid.
bringing them back to their true self. And it's also you know, without me taking over the interview here, you know, bringing them back to the stronger person that they've become because of
that's right.
experiences they've had. And like you say, it is their true self, and it's recognising how strong they actually are, even though you certainly don't feel like it when you're going through the experiences, that's for sure.
No, you don't. So I guess that the worst, like, he threw me in front of cars, he did all sorts of things. And some of that was post-separation, so after I'd separated from him. He kidnapped my daughter, who was a little baby. I was still breastfeeding her, and he took her away for 4 days, which was extremely traumatising. And I had to actually agree to supervised visits just to get him to bring her back. I had supervised visits with her. Of course, that didn't ever happen. As soon as I had her, I locked the door, and she's now nearly 30. So it's interesting talking about it, because it does feel very close as I'm talking about it, that level of fear that I felt at the time. It's funny. It's you know, you think that it's way beyond, and then anyway. So when I was in London, so we went over to England, and he was, I won't go into what he was doing, but he was doing all sorts of illegal things, and so that he didn't have to work, so he could watch me, to the point where I was pregnant, and I had my little boy that I had before I met him, who was about 11 months of age, and we ended up living in a homeless hotel through the homelessness system in London, which was pretty scary. And he'd given me a really severe facial bruising, where he'd actually poked me in the eye. He was using his 2 fingers and he was poking me in the eye one night while he was assaulting me and throwing me around. And it was in a friend's house in a flat, and we were in a bedroom, in the bedroom that we were staying in. And so I didn't make a sound through the whole assault, because I was worried about waking my friend up, which is just appalling. But he ended up giving me, I don't know if you've ever seen Once Were Warriors, the facial bruising of the woman in that movie, where my whole face was bruised and swollen, and I thought he'd actually gouged my eye out. The pain was so intense. And I literally stood in front of the mirror, because I could feel this big bulky thing, and I thought I was holding my eyeball in my hand. He ran off when he realised he's injured me. He'd gone. And I'm looking in the bathroom mirror, and I'm sort of like, I'm willing myself to look to see what he'd done, because I was so frightened that I was going to be blind or blinded in that eye. But I think that was the moment. And I remember a little voice in my voice saying to me, "This man he's blinded you. This is what this relationship's cost you. You have to get out." Yeah. Of course, I was on my own in England. He then kidnapped me and put me in a van with my child and took me half way across England, it was, but I got out. I got my parents to send me money, and I got out. And my mother said, but I had to get him to come with me so that I could actually get on the plane and get out. I had to let him come with me.
Right.
My mother said when I got off the plane that she could still see the black eye, the bruising, and I still have funny kind of bruising or discoloration of my face. But yeah, so I then got back to Adelaide, stepped off the plane. I went to my parents' place. Then I moved to my sister's house, and I was pregnant. I did return to the relationship, but I never lived with him again. So I stayed with him until my daughter was about 3 months old, and he was going to counselling and all that sort of thing. But I just realised that the counselling was creating more of a monster because he was using the counselling language against me. So
it is quite clear, Chris, that you have had a lot of experiences, and you know, I'm for one very happy to know that you have come through it.
Yeah,
and you know, it's not clearly not a small thing to have come through. So let's talk a bit about what you're doing now.
Yeah,
because I find, particularly given what you've gone through, what you are doing now. So you told me previously to this interview that you were working on the DV crisis line. I believe this is specifically to Adelaide. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct.
So, yeah, tell me a little bit about that if you don't mind. So what is the difference between, say, something like a DV crisis line and 1-800-RESPECT?
So 1-800-RESPECT is more of a counselling trauma line where you can talk to a counsellor about what's happening and unpack some of your experiences, and friends can ring and sort of talk about their experiences with, you know, trying to support a friend or a family member that's going through it. Yeah. If the so the 1-800-RESPECT can put people through to the crisis line if required, but crisis line is really where women need assistance to leave. Right. So it's either it's a range of things. You can look at safety planning for a woman, or you can actually assist her to get into safe accommodation right there and then. Right. So it's an interview process where you do what's called a domestic violence risk assessment. So there's a series of questions, and then it's one of those things where government funding means that there's certain criteria that people have to fit to get accommodation. And generally, my approach was to always discuss with women around what kinds of other supports they had, whether they could go to family, because that, you know, safe accommodation is basically a cheap motel room, and it's a whole sector that you're moving into, which is the homelessness sector, which can be very, very difficult and very hard. And so I always say that psychologically it's more beneficial for women to stay with family or friends and be supported, because when you're in motel you can't have visitors, it's a very controlled environment, sort of similar to where you've come from in some ways, except that you're safe from violence.
Yeah, of course. And so with the DV crisis line in Adelaide, I'm assuming that there are other lines throughout Australia similar?
Yes, there are. Yep, there are, definitely. There's I believe it's called Safe Steps in Victoria. There's one in New South Wales. I'm not sure about, there's one in Brisbane. I'm actually not sure about Perth. We probably didn't get many. So the 1-800-RESPECT line is national. And so the women on the call line are taking calls from all over the place.
Yeah.
And then they would redirect if they needed local services, they would redirect them to services in the local area. But that was a 24-hour line, so women could ring up at 2:00 in the morning if they were feeling really, you know, down and freaked out. Yeah, and you know, it's definitely for women who are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder or some other, you know, mental illness around trauma that could have been childhood related, because domestic violence, you know, we think about it as a relationship based thing, but often you experience domestic violence as a child.
That is a really good point.
Yeah. So, you know, it's a lifelong experience, and I think we experience in lots of different ways.
Yeah. That is a really good point. So on to my next question is how did you come to working within a shelter?
So I'd worked in shelters before a long time ago, but I went a different way. I decided to take, when I first started working, when I first got my degree in around 2009, I pulled back because I just realised it wasn't the area I wanted to work in at that point in my life. I was probably too close to it just wasn't where I wanted to work. I just decided that traumatically it was probably not good for me.
Yeah, fair enough.
So I was looking for work, and so WISA is the agency that I work for, which is Women's Safety Services SA, and that's a consortium, a whole lot of different women's shelters that have joined together to form a big agency for funding opportunities, better advocacy, more sort of aligned advocacy.
Yep.
So that's going through that process of managing that big change for all of the services at this point. And so WISA had the domestic violence crisis line that was always a 9 to 5 based service. Mm-hmm. And then there was a homelessness gateway that did after hours, and now it's a 24-hour line. And yeah, the jobs came up, and I just thought, well, I guess over time I decided that I liked crisis work. I really enjoy crisis work. So, and the fact that my experience meant that I was able to, women who are coming into that system often feel much more comfortable with a woman who's actually been through it, so they understand the internal stuff, because I think it's hard for someone who hasn't been through it to understand why you still love the person. It's really easy from the outside to look and go, but how can you love him when he treats you like this?
Yeah.
Well, actually, it's really complicated. So,
yeah, it is.
Because those incidents of violence are moments, and then there's all these other moments as well, and it's difficult to explain it. So when you're talking to someone and you just kind of, you know that they understand it on a embodied level, and you don't need to explain a whole lot of stuff. It makes it a lot easier to feel like there's a future, because you're looking at this person, or the person, that's what I've found with clients, is they've said, I look at you and I see where you're at now, and you were in the same position or a worse position than I was when you left, and now you're here, so I know it's possible.
Absolutely. That is so true. Yeah. And it is really a case of, well, she's done it, and so, there's hope for me.
Yeah. It was funny because I actually remember the moment that I actually was Tina Turner. She was being interviewed about the domestic violence she'd experienced, and I thought, oh my God, because I always minimised my experience. So I was like, oh, she's really been through it. I just told you my story, and I hear it and I think, how could you minimise that? But, it's funny how you still do, you forget how severe it is.
And it's almost like a coping mechanism, isn't it, to try and minimise it? So
I think so. It's too difficult to sort of really face up to how close you came to, being killed, really, on some occasions.
Wow.
The position was coming up. They'd gone 24 hours. I was at a point in my life where I really wanted to have work where I didn't have to work all the time. Mm-hmm. I'd like more like part-time work or flexible work, however you want to call it, but I still wanted money enough to pay my mortgage and live comfortably and have good super. So I decided to do that, and it was challenging to do night shift. I found probably that I was too old to have done it. Like, I'm 52, so I think that I was probably a little bit old to have started it. I'm actually 51. I don't know why I always do that. I always say I'm the age I am when I'm going to turn it. But anyway, I think I was too old when I started. So I really wasn't coping with the lack of sleep, or the sleep changes in my sleep patterns. So I'm actually an artist as well. I paint, and I'm that's what I wake up every day and want to do. And so that's my focus at this point, is I'm a very active, I'm into social justice. It's like a fire in my belly. I can't ever switch it off. And so that'll always be part of who I am and part of what I do. But I am coming to a point in my life where I just want to paint and paint and paint and paint. So
good on you.
More of that. Yeah.
Good on you. So, you've given us so much interesting insight today. I'm just blown away. If there is someone out there, and I think you've already answered this, but I'm going to ask the question again. If there is someone who's listening out there who knows that they want to / need to leave, but they may not have the family support, like you said before, so where can they go for assistance?
So they can just ring DVCL, the Domestic Violence Crisis Line. It's a 24-hour line. Just don't call when your partner's there, because they won't talk to you when your partner's there, because, you know, there's been some pretty terrible things that happened for women when the partner realises what they're doing. Yep. So make sure you're in a safe place, and most times women can find some way of doing that, even if it's if they're dropping children off to childcare, or sometimes you can go to any domestic. You can actually walk into a social, like a community service agency, like Uniting Care, Anglicare, anywhere, and just say, or a women's health centre, I'm in domestic violence, I need to call the Domestic Violence Crisis Line, and I can't do it at home because it's not safe. Actually, and a really good way of Housing SA as well, Housing SA officers, if you walk into the front office and you say to the customer service officer that you can't go home because you're fearing for your safety, they should, on a good day, the process is that they should assist you. That's what's supposed to happen. You can also talk to Centrelink as well, go to the hospital, just go anywhere that you can, even if you make up a story that your child needing to go to hospital, and go to the hospital and ask to see a social worker. So once you call the Domestic Violence Crisis Line, you'll be sort of asked to tell your story a little bit. They'll ask you, you know, date of birth and those sorts of things, and then you are able to disclose that information if you want. They'll, you know, the worker will still talk to you if you don't want to disclose that and you just want to talk about what's happening. Doing a domestic violence risk assessment is a really useful, it can be a really kind of weird process, but it's a really useful process, because what it does is gives you a sense of, like I said before, you know, my story is really extreme, yet I minimised it. So if I told my story to somebody on the Domestic Violence Crisis Line, that's one of the things that I would talk women through, is this is what your risk is. It's really high, and talk about what that means. So often that can be something that really pulls women up, and they get that external, that external affirmation that what they're actually going through something, because often the man will deny and say, my husband used to say, well, call the police, go on. What do you think they're going to do? Unfortunately, it was in the early 1990s, and so often he was right. But it's very different now. Police, all police stations, even rural ones and regional ones have, so country police stations have a domestic violence, so it's called a family violence officer, and you can talk to them. So there's lots of ways of connecting into this system. Just keep trying, and just look, you can also ring 1-800-RESPECT, and they can talk you through, and talk to the person on the phone about that, and then they can, sometimes you'll get rung back. You have to leave a message and then they'll ring you back, but always leave a message. Yeah. That's my advice as well. If you do ring the Domestic Violence Crisis Line and it tells you to wait on the line until a call, don't do that. Just hang up and leave a message, and someone will get back to you. It's a quicker way of doing it. But 1-800-RESPECT is a fantastic way to start the conversation and start exploring the situation, and then they can link you into services. There's also, like, women's health services are really brilliant around domestic violence, and they'll always have a domestic violence counsellor there. There's some agencies like Uniting Care Wesley has domestic violence counselling. So there's lots of services available, and I'm not going to say it's easy, because it's not, and it's always tempting to go back, because of course as soon as it's the cycle of violence. Of course, once you've left, there's always the honeymoon period, and that's the most difficult to resist. That is the most difficult to resist. I would love to, and have actually been thinking about doing a cycle of violence from the victim's perspective, and so that we can sort of work with women around how to get through that period where you start to feel empathy for him, and those sorts of things. So
yeah, that would be really a valuable research project maybe to do, I think.
Yeah. I don't know if it exists already, but I'll have a look.
It's something to look into, definitely.
Yeah. I'm not sure how long I'll stay in the sector for. It's actually, like I said, I'm probably moving towards more development of those sorts of things. I'm more interested in working with women around their experiences and then turning that into toolkits to help other women. I think that I'm probably at the end of my, because I mean, in between having worked in the domestic violence sector, I've worked in the homelessness sector and the youth sector and whole lots of different sectors, and so I've always worked with domestic violence victims. They've always been my clients, but just not directly in a service. So I think I'm moving towards that thing of not really, it's not sustainable for me emotionally to continue doing case management, and I feel like my skills would be better off used elsewhere. I mean, in the middle of this, I also went to uni part-time and got a degree in anthropology. So
wow. So yeah, and I think that it's really important for you too, as a survivor, that you do recognise, when it's time for you to look after your mental health as well. Yeah. Because you're busy looking after, like you say, the ladies who you empathise with.
Yeah.
So it's almost like a cycle in itself, isn't it? And then maybe one day those ladies that you're helping will be able to take over work that you do, which is fantastic.
That's right, yeah. And look, I think it's a really important point that you made before, Ali, is around the strength of women. That when you're in that point of leaving, you feel sometimes there's that sort of adrenaline rush of feeling really empowered around leaving, and yes, I've done it, and then it starts to get hard and it starts to crash around, and your kids are wanting you to go back to dad, and we miss dad, and there's all of those sorts of things that are really difficult to fight. But and then he'll ring and start to put you down, and you feel weak, and you've got all of these competing things, people saying no, stay away, don't go back, and him saying please come. And I think that women need to remember that it's okay that we live in a really violent culture, and we live in a culture that promotes male violence and that supports male violence. And so I think we're in an era now where, they call it toxic masculinity, but that's starting to be unpacked, and men are actually starting to be a lot more aware of how toxic masculinity is for themselves as well as the people around them. But basically, I think women need to remember how strong they are, and really, every morning get up and talk about yourself as a survivor. And I think that the thing that made a shift for me was when I realised that I'm not that victim word. It's always such a negative connotation, but I always describe myself as a target of violence rather than a victim, because target is where there's an active process of targeting me. And I have been in 3 different relationships where violence was used to control me, and it didn't work for any of them. They all lost me. But like you and I discussed this before, that, once you've got that second relationship where violence is being used, you start to really think, oh my God, is it me? Is there something that I'm actually doing to attract this into my life? And there's a lot of new age stuff out there that says, you attract this sort of stuff, and that you need there's a lesson you need to learn. And it's like, no, that's not actually what's happening. This is political violence. And, we live in a patriarchy, and it is political violence. And I think that survivor language, that strength language, is really, really important for women to really embrace.
Absolutely. I think that is the perfect place to end the interview.
Yep.
We are no longer victims. We are survivors.
And like I say to all the women out, whenever I ended my phone calls on the domestic violence crisis line, I would say, stay strong and stay safe.
Oh, love it. Thank you so much, Chris. You have just given some really, really valuable information today. So to any ladies out there listening who, as we said, you're in a toxic relationship and you need to get out, or, that you want to, or you're in a situation, please do ring 1-800-RESPECT, and they will be able to direct you in the right direction to go from there. Also, it will be remiss of me not to say that if you are in an immediate situation where you need immediate help, please ring 000.
Absolutely.
Okay. So, all right, we're going to end the interview there. Thank you so much, Chris.
No worries. Great talking to you, Ali. Bye, everyone.
hope you enjoyed today's show, and thanks for listening. If you would like to share your story of survival, or you have a topic you would like to hear about on the program, reach out to me via email, welcome@themotivationmama.com, or find me, The Motivation Mama, on Instagram or Facebook. And don't forget, the greatest project that you will ever work on is you. Happy day, beautiful.